We bought this buffet from Facebook Marketplace for only $30. Can you believe that someone was selling this thing for so cheap? First, we removed the hardware. When it comes to doors, I used to remove the hinges, but almost every single time I would have issues putting the hinges back on. So now I usually either tape off the hinges, or in this case, I'm just leaving them on and painting them black with the rest of the furniture. Then we cleaned everything with Crud Cutter. This piece was pretty dusty because it sat in our workshop for like over a year, so we had to remove that dust, but we also wanted to remove any oils, grease, and grime that was on it. While my husband cleaned, he paid attention to where all of the damage was, so then he could come back and fill them. He used Quickwood to fill them in. It's my favorite stuff to fix chips that are bigger than like a 1/4 inch. It dries hard and it dries in about an hour, and it doesn't shrink or crack. After the Quickwood was dry, I sanded the top of the buffet down to raw wood. I had to sand the Quickwood down flush with the wood around it, and then there were a lot of scratches on this piece, and I wanted to sand those out as much as possible. If I would have just sanded a few spots down to bare wood where the scratches were and the Quickwood, the top would have looked really splotchy even after I painted it. So I just sanded the whole thing down to wood. While I was sanding, I also sanded the edge of the doors down a little bit. Doors are notorious for getting stuck once you put some layers of paint on them, so I like to sand those down a little bit extra before I paint them and make room for the extra layers of paint. And while I was at it, I also sanded the rest of the dresser with a medium grit foam sanding sponge to help the paint stick better. And while I was doing that, I noticed some more chips and holes, so I filled those in with regular wood filler. So did you notice that these doors don't stop where they're supposed to? They go in way too far when you push them closed. But I bought a bunch of these metal stoppers on eBay, and they just go right back into the holes where the stoppers used to be. So I replaced those for the doors and the bottom drawer. And then I cleaned up all of the dust. This Waverly chalk paint is so thick. Holy moly, it is thick. So I had to add a lot of water to thin it out enough for it to spray nicely. I think I added probably like 30% water this time. Typically I put like 10 to 15% water into the paint to thin it out for the paint sprayer. But hey, the extra water made the paint stretch even further, so that is pretty awesome. If I brushed this paint on, I would have added probably like 10 to 15% water instead of the 30%. I used my Wagner Flexio 3000 to spray the chalk paint onto the buffet, and I tried to spray a thin coat so I wouldn't get runs in the paint. And then I left the paint to dry for a couple of hours. When I came back, I could see the wood grain everywhere that I had sanded down to raw wood. And there were more dings and scratches that had to be filled. So I filled all of those areas. And then a few hours later, when everything was dry, I sanded it all down. It was after the kids went to bed, so I sanded by hand instead of using my electric sander. Then I cleaned up the dust and I sprayed another coat of paint. After spraying, I used the paintbrush to touch up some spots inside of the cabinet. that the paint sprayer couldn't reach, and to paint the inside edges on the drawers. And then it dried overnight. The next morning, I emptied out most of the paint and put some water-based polyurethane into the sprayer. The residual paint left in the container tinted the water-based poly, which is exactly what I want when top coating darker colors. Otherwise, the water-based polyurethane can sometimes look streaky or foggy. And then I sprayed 3 coats of polyurethane onto the buffet. The top coat gives the chalk paint some sheen so it isn't matte, and it helps the paint be more scratch resistant. In between the first and second coat, I lightly sanded with a fine grit foam sponge to smooth the surface a little bit. If I didn't have the sprayer, I would have just used Minwax polyacrylic in the spray can instead of this poly in the paint sprayer, or maybe I would have used some wax, but I prefer poly. If you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button and leave us a comment. All right, here is what it looked like before, and here is what it looks like now. Doesn't it look so good in black? I think the elegance of this buffet goes so well with the black. And since it's so elegant, I thought it needed a little bling bling. I went back and forth between 2 different types of hardware for this one, but I ended up on the drop pulls. I absolutely love the drop pulls on this piece. Let me know what you think of this new look in the comments, and I'm going to list this piece for $300. We'll see how fast it sells and if it sells for full price. Want to turn your hobby into cash? Click the link in my comments to download the free pricing guide that we use to buy and sell furniture.